Michael Foster gripped the crumpled eviction notice as his son Ethan built a fort from empty moving boxes. 6 months since Morrison Construction folded, taking his steady carpentry work with it. 6 months of watching his savings dwindle like sawdust in the wind. The one-bedroom apartment they downgraded to felt smaller every day, his tools stacked against walls where furniture should be, Ethan's bed wedged into what should have been their dining area. Sunlight filtered through their single window, illuminating the dust motes dancing above Ethan's makeshift playground. The 8-year-old had adapted with the resilience only children possess, treating each setback as a new adventure. He'd never complained about sharing the tiny space, about moving schools mid-year, about birthday presents that never materialized. But Michael caught the longing glances his son cast toward the Thompson kids across the street with their backyard swing set in separate bedrooms. A worn baseball glove sat on their kitchen counter, the leather cracking at the seams. Michael had bought it 3 Christmases ago when work had been steady and hope came easily. Now it served as a daily reminder of all he wanted to give his son but couldn't afford. Little league fees, decent equipment, the kind of childhood where money wasn't the silent worry threading through every conversation. The mail slot clanged, breaking his thoughts. Bills, most likely. More demands he couldn't meet. But among the expected collection notices lay a cream-colored envelope bearing an attorney's letterhead from a town he'd never heard of, Millbrook, Indiana. Michael tore it open, scanning the formal language with mounting confusion. According to the document, he had inherited a Victorian mansion from his great-uncle Thomas Blackwood, a relative he'd never known existed. The inheritance included the property and funds to cover property taxes for exactly 1 year. After that, he would be on his own. He read the letter 3 more times, looking for the catch. People didn't just inherit mansions from strangers. Yet the attorney's contact information seemed legitimate. The enclosed property deed and tax account details too detailed to be fraudulent. Ethan peered around his box fortress, curiosity brightening his features. Are we really going to live in a mansion? His son's imagination was already running wild, those blue eyes, so like his mother's before she'd left them 4 years ago, wide with possibility. Michael hesitated, not wanting to feed false hope. It's not really a mansion, buddy. Just an old house that needs work. The letter says it's been empty for 30 years. But Mrs. Jenkins said mansions have secret rooms and hidden treasure. Ethan's face lit up the way it used to when Michael would tell bedtime stories about brave knights in magical kingdoms. He couldn't help but smile. Their elderly neighbor must have overheard them discussing the letter when it arrived. Mrs. Jenkins had lived in the area her whole life and apparently remembered when the Blackwood place had been the grandest house for miles. She also remembered when it became the town's most infamous eyesore. We'll see what we find when we get there, but don't get your hopes too high. The drive to Millbrook took 3 hours through rolling farmland and small communities bearing the unmistakable hollowed-out look of rural economic decline. Shuttered factories, abandoned storefronts with sun-bleached for lease signs, houses with sagging porches and peeling paint. Ethan pressed his face to the passenger window, watching grain silos and weathered barns drift past like monuments to a simpler time. Michael found himself thinking about his own childhood in similar country, where neighbors knew each other's names and people still believed in honest work and keeping your word. He'd followed his father into carpentry, learning to read wood grain, like others read books, understanding which boards would hold and which needed replacing. For 15 years, he'd built custom cabinets and restored old homes throughout the county, taking pride in bringing beauty back to forgotten places. The irony wasn't lost on him. Now he was the one in need of restoration. Millbrook appeared around a bend in the highway like something from a Norman Rockwell painting. If Rockwell had painted during harder times. The main street held the bones of prosperity, a pharmacy with hand-painted signs, a diner with red vinyl booths visible through plate glass windows, a hardware store with genuine wooden floors that likely creaked under customers' feet. But half the storefronts stood empty, their windows papered with faded advertisements and sun-bleached vacancy notices. Michael pulled into Wilson's Market to ask for directions. The elderly woman behind the counter had silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that took his measure in one appraising glance. "You must be Thomas's great-nephew." Her tone carried the weight of someone delivering both welcome and warning. "I'm Margaret Wilson. I live next door to the Blackwood place." "Yes, ma'am." "Michael Foster. This is my son, Ethan." Mrs. Wilson's expression softened when she looked at the boy. "Well, Ethan, I hope you're not afraid of big old houses. The Blackwood Mansion is quite a sight." "Are there really secret passages?" Ethan asked with the earnestness only children could muster. Mrs. Wilson glanced at Michael, something unreadable, passing across her weathered features. "Old houses hold many secrets, child. Some are wonderful discoveries. Others," her voice trailed off momentarily, "some things are better left undisturbed." The mansion sat on 5 acres at the end of Elm Street, separated from its neighbors by overgrown hedges and a wrought iron fence that had surrendered to rust and time. Michael's first glimpse made his heart sink and soar simultaneously. The 3-story Victorian was magnificent and tragic, like a grand dame fallen on hard times. The architecture was stunning. Bay windows with intricate trim, a wraparound porch supported by carved columns, a tower room that rose above the main structure, like a castle turret. But 30 years of neglect had taken their toll. Paint peeled from every surface in great curling sheets. Several windows were boarded up. The porch sagged in the middle and missing shingles left the roof looking like a smile with broken teeth. "Wow," Ethan breathed, and Michael couldn't tell if it was wonder or disappointment. They walked the perimeter slowly, Michael's carpenter's eye cataloging the work ahead. The foundation looked solid, built from locally quarried stone a century ago. The bones of the house were strong. It would be the cosmetic restoration that would test his skills and patience. The front door key had come with the inheritance papers, along with a note explaining that utilities had been maintained at minimal levels to prevent pipes from freezing. When Michael turned the key and pushed open the heavy oak door, it swung inward with a groan that seemed to echo through empty rooms. The entry hall took his breath away. A grand staircase curved upward, its banister carved from what looked like solid walnut. The floors were wide plank hardwood dulled by dust and neglect, but showing glimpses of rich honey color beneath the grime. Crown molding ran along 14-foot ceilings, and stained glass panels flanked the front door, casting colored shadows across the space. "Dad, look at this," Ethan called from the parlor. He stood beneath a crystal chandelier, its hundreds of prisms catching the afternoon light streaming through tall windows. Michael joined his son, running his hand along the fireplace mantel. The marble was veined in gray and gold, and the carved details showed the work of master craftsmen. Even in its current state, the room radiated elegance and history. They moved through the house like archaeologists exploring ancient ruins. The dining room could seat 12 easily, its mahogany table still gleaming under a layer of dust. The kitchen retained its original cabinetry, built-in hutches and pantries that spoke of an era when families cooked elaborate meals from scratch. Michael noticed the quality of the woodwork, the attention to detail that marked the difference between houses built to last generations and those slapped together to satisfy modern demands for quick occupancy. He'd worked on enough historic renovations to recognize true craftsmanship when he saw it. Upstairs, they found 6 bedrooms each with its own character. The master suite included a sitting area and private bathroom with a clawfoot tub deep enough for soaking away a day's work. Ethan claimed the bedroom in the tower, drawn by its circular walls and windows that looked out over the entire town. "Can this really be ours?" His son's voice held a mixture of hope and disbelief. Michael placed his hand on Ethan's shoulder, feeling the weight of possibility and responsibility in equal measure. "If we can make it work, buddy, it's going to take everything we've got." As the sun set behind the mansion's towers and gables casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn, Michael found himself standing on the front porch with Ethan. Both of them quiet in the face of what lay ahead. The house needed everything: new wiring, updated plumbing, a complete exterior restoration, and probably a dozen other problems he hadn't discovered yet. But beneath the decay, he could see what this place had been and what it could become again. Mrs. Wilson appeared at the fence carrying a covered dish that smelled like pot roast and vegetables. "Figured you two might be hungry after your long day," she said, passing the meal through the gate. "And I wanted to give you fair warning. This house has a way of surprising people. Thomas Blackwood was an unusual man, and he left things the way he wanted them found." Michael accepted the warm dish gratefully. "What kind of things?" Mrs. Wilson smiled, but there was something cautious in her expression. "Oh, you'll see soon enough. Just remember, Thomas was a man who believed in taking care of family, even family he'd never met. He had his reasons for everything, including choosing you." As she walked back to her own house, Michael found himself wondering what she meant. But watching Ethan's face glow with excitement as he planned where to put his bed and his books, Michael decided that some mysteries could wait. For tonight, it was enough that they had a home, even if it came with more questions than answers. 3 weeks into their new life, Michael and Ethan had established a rhythm. Mornings were for cleanup and assessment, afternoons for the odd carpentry jobs Michael could find in town, and evenings for the slow work of making the mansion livable. They'd managed to get the utilities fully operational and had claimed the 2 bedrooms with the least damage for their temporary quarters. Ethan threw himself into the project with the enthusiasm only an 8-year-old could muster. He'd appointed himself chief dust removal specialist and unofficial mansion historian, pestering Mrs. Wilson with questions about the Blackwood family whenever she brought over meals or checked on their progress. It was Ethan who made the discovery that changed everything. "Dad, there's something weird about this wall," his voice echoed from the main parlor, where he'd been carefully cleaning the wainscoting with a soft cloth. Michael looked up from the window frame he was restoring. "Weird how the wallpaper is coming loose, but there's something behind it. Not just more wall, something else." Michael set down his tools and joined his son at the far wall. Ethan had been working methodically section by section and had uncovered a spot where the vintage wallpaper had pulled away from the plaster beneath. But instead of revealing more of the wall's original surface, there was a small recess barely visible in the afternoon light. Michael ran his fingers along the edge, feeling the outline of what appeared to be a deliberate hiding place cut into the wall itself. The recess was about the size of his palm, carefully carved and smoothed. "Should we see what's in there?" Ethan's voice hushed with excitement. Michael nodded, working his fingers into the space. His fingertips touched something smooth and cool. Metal. Carefully, he extracted an ornate brass key unlike anything he had seen in the house. The key was heavy, intricately carved with symbols and patterns that seemed to tell a story. The head was shaped like a heart, and tiny engravings covered every surface. "Wow," Ethan breathed. "It's like something from a pirate movie." Michael turned the key over in his palm, studying the craftsmanship. Whoever had made this had been an artist as well as a locksmith. The symbols weren't random decorations. They were purposeful, meaningful. Some looked like compass points. Others resembled architectural elements he'd seen throughout the house. "Let's see if it fits any of the doors." Ethan was already heading toward the front hall. They spent the next hour testing every lock in the house. The key was too ornate for the simple door locks, too large for the small cabinet latches, and the wrong shape entirely for the modern deadbolts that had been added over the years. But Michael noticed something else. As they moved through the mansion, the symbols on the key matched details he'd been seeing throughout the house without really registering them. The same compass, rose pattern carved into the key, appeared in the banister newel post. The interlocking circles were repeated in the dining room ceiling medallion. The heart shape showed up in the stained glass panels by the front door. "Ethan, I think this key is supposed to lead us somewhere, but not to a door. To other clues." That evening, after Ethan had gone to bed, Michael sat at the kitchen table with the key under a bright lamp, sketching the symbols in a notebook. The more he studied them, the more convinced he became that they formed a map or code. But a map to what the next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Michael was replacing a broken window in the dining room when he heard a car pull up the gravel drive. Through the glass, he saw a black sedan, expensive and out of place in their rural setting. The man who emerged wore a tailored suit and carried a leather briefcase. He was about Michael's age, with silver at his temples and the kind of confident bearing that came from never having to worry about money. He knocked on the front door with authority. "Mr. Foster, I'm Alexander Sterling, attorney at law. I represent certain interested parties regarding this property." Michael wiped his hands on a rag before shaking Sterling's offered hand. The man's grip was firm, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "What can I do for you, Mr. Sterling? I understand you've recently inherited this property from Thomas Blackwood. I wanted to discuss a business proposition that might interest you." They sat in the parlor, Sterling's expensive shoes as incongruous against the dust-covered floors. The lawyer opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Mr. Foster, I'll be direct. This house is a money pit. The restoration costs alone will run well into 6 figures, and that's assuming you don't discover any major structural issues. I have clients who are interested in purchasing the property for land development." Michael glanced at the papers Sterling had spread on the coffee table. The proposed purchase price was substantial enough to buy the decent house in town and still have money left over for Ethan's future. That's a generous offer. But we just got here. We haven't even had time to fully assess what needs to be done. Sterling's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Mr. Foster, I've been watching this property for years. I know its history, its problems, its potential. Thomas Blackwood he was an eccentric man with unusual ideas about family and inheritance. He may have left you this house, but he didn't do you any favors. Something in Sterling's tone set Michael on edge. What do you mean by that? Blackwood had theories about bloodlines, about deserving heirs. He believed in... Sterling paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Let's just say he believed certain families owed debts to other families. This house was his way of settling scores. Michael thought about Mrs. Wilson's cryptic warnings about the careful way she spoke about Thomas Blackwood's intentions. Mr. Sterling, are you saying there's more to this inheritance than I know? Sterling leaned forward, his professional mask slipping slightly. I'm saying Thomas Blackwood was obsessed with the past. He spent decades researching genealogies, tracking bloodlines, trying to right what he considered historical wrongs. He left you this house for reasons that have nothing to do with generosity. Before Michael could respond, Ethan's voice called from upstairs. Dad, you need to see this. Michael excused himself and found Ethan in the library, a room they hadn't spent much time exploring. The boy was standing by a built-in bookcase pointing at something behind the volumes. I was looking at the old books, and I noticed this one was loose. Ethan explained, pulling out a leather-bound volume. Behind it was another small recess similar to the one where they'd found the key. This hiding spot contained a folded piece of parchment, yellowed with age. Michael unfolded it carefully, revealing what appeared to be a floor plan of the mansion, but with areas marked that didn't correspond to any rooms he'd seen. The symbols from the key were scattered throughout the drawing, connected by dotted lines that suggested a path through the house. At the bottom, in spidery handwriting, someone had written, "For the rightful heir when the time comes to claim what was lost." Mr. Foster, Sterling's voice called from downstairs. Is everything all right? Michael quickly refolded the parchment and tucked it into his pocket. We're fine, just found some old books. When they returned to the parlor, Sterling was standing by the window studying the grounds with obvious interest. Beautiful property, he said, perfect for subdivision development. I appreciate your offer, Mr. Sterling, but I'm not ready to sell. Sterling's expression hardened. Mr. Foster, I strongly advise you to reconsider. This house has a history of bringing misfortune to its owners. Thomas Blackwood disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The family before him lost everything and fled in the middle of the night. Perhaps it would be wise to break that pattern. After Sterling left, Michael sat on the front porch with the parchment spread across his knees. The drawing was detailed and precise, showing not just the mansion's layout, but also what appeared to be hidden passages and secret rooms. If it was authentic, Thomas Blackwood had designed this place as an elaborate puzzle. Mrs. Wilson appeared at the fence as if she'd been waiting for Sterling to leave. That man's been sniffing around this place for 20 years, she said without preamble, ever since Thomas disappeared. Mrs. Wilson, what really happened to Thomas Blackwood? The elderly woman looked at the mansion with something like sadness. Thomas was a good man who made some hard choices. He spent his later years trying to make amends for things that happened long before you were born. He believed in justice, even when it came at personal cost. Sterling said something about debts between families. Mrs. Wilson nodded slowly. The Blackwood and Sterling families have a complicated history. Thomas felt responsible for wrongs done by previous generations. He wanted to make things right, but Alexander Sterling, well, he has different ideas about how debts should be paid. That night after Ethan was asleep, Michael studied the parchment by lamplight. The more he examined it, the more convinced he became that the ornate key was meant to unlock not just physical doors, but the secrets of the house itself. The symbols formed a trail, and if he could follow it correctly, he might discover what Thomas Blackwood had really left behind. As he traced the dotted path with his finger, Michael realized that his inheritance was more than just a house. It was a challenge, a test, and possibly a gift that could change everything for him and Ethan. But it was also something Alexander Sterling wanted very badly, which meant it was likely more valuable than anyone had told him. The ornate key felt warm in his palm as he made his decision. Tomorrow he and Ethan would begin following the trail Thomas Blackwood had left for them. Whatever secrets lay hidden in the mansion's walls, they deserved to know the truth. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that made the mansion feel more mysterious than welcoming. Michael had slept poorly, his mind churning over Sterling's warnings and the parchment's promise of hidden secrets. But Ethan's excitement was infectious as they prepared to follow the trail laid out in Thomas Blackwood's drawing. "It's like a real treasure hunt," Ethan said, bouncing on his toes as Michael spread the parchment across the kitchen table. "Where do we start?" Michael studied the diagram, comparing it to his growing familiarity with the house's layout. The first symbol, a compass rose, was marked in what appeared to be the library. They had already found the parchment there, which suggested they were on the right track. The library was a cozy room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a large window that looked out over the overgrown garden. Most of the books were still in place, volumes on history, architecture, and what appeared to be genealogical research. Michael noticed that many of the genealogy books were marked with bookmarks and handwritten notes. Following the parchment's guidance, they focused their search on the fireplace area. The mantel was carved mahogany, matching the library's built-in shelving. Michael ran his hands along the wood, feeling for anything that might be loose or unusual. "Dad, look at this," Ethan called from beside the hearth. He'd discovered that one of the decorative tiles around the fireplace opening was slightly raised compared to the others. Michael knelt beside his son and examined the tile. When he pressed it gently, it shifted under his touch. Working carefully, he managed to pry it free, revealing a shallow compartment behind. Inside was a leather photo album, its cover embossed with the same heart symbol from the ornate key. They carried the album to the window seat and opened it together. The first pages contained formal portraits from what appeared to be the 1960s and 70s. A distinguished man with dark hair and kind eyes, sometimes alone, sometimes with a beautiful woman with auburn hair and a gentle smile. "That must be Thomas Blackwood," Michael said, studying the man's face for any family resemblance. There was something familiar about the eyes, the set of the jaw. As they turned the pages, the photos became more personal and intimate. Thomas and the woman walking through gardens, sharing meals, laughing together on what appeared to be travels across Europe. But Michael noticed something troubling in the later photos. The woman looked sad, and Thomas appeared increasingly isolated. The final pages of the album contained pictures of a young boy, perhaps Ethan's age, with the same dark hair as Thomas and the woman's bright smile. But written beside many of these photos were dates and cryptic annotations in the same spidery handwriting they'd seen on the parchment. Catherine's son, one notation read, "Born September 15, 1972, the future we cannot claim." Another photo showed the boy with what appeared to be different parents, a stern-faced man in a business suit and a woman who was clearly not Catherine. The annotation here was more disturbing. "Richard's claim, the lie we must live." Michael felt a chill as he began to understand what the photos were telling him. The symbols and numbers scattered throughout the album weren't just decorative. They were part of a code, references to specific locations and dates. "Ethan, I think these pictures are telling us a story about Thomas's family, but it's complicated. They spent the morning decoding the album's mysteries. The symbols matched those on the ornate key and the parchment, creating a clear trail through the house. Each photo was annotated with coordinates that corresponded to rooms and specific locations within the mansion. The pattern that emerged was both romantic and tragic. Thomas had clearly been in love with Catherine, but she had been married to someone else, someone named Richard, who appeared to be Alexander Sterling's father based on several formal photographs of the two men together. The young boy was the central mystery. The photos suggested he was Catherine and Thomas's child, but the annotations indicated he'd been raised by Richard as his own son. The final entries in the album were the most heartbreaking. Photos of Catherine's funeral with Thomas standing apart from the other mourners, and pictures of the boy growing up from a distance, as if Thomas had been watching over him, but unable to claim him. "Dad, this is really sad," Ethan said, studying a photo of Thomas alone in what appeared to be the same library. He loved them, but couldn't be with them. Michael nodded, feeling an unexpected connection to the man who'd left him this inheritance. Thomas had been trying to protect and provide for a child he couldn't acknowledge publicly, a situation that resonated deeply with Michael's own struggles as a single father. The album's final clue led them to the mansion's tower room, Ethan's chosen bedroom. According to the parchment, they needed to find the next symbol, an interlocking circle pattern somewhere in that circular space. The tower room was unique in the house with windows facing all directions and a domed ceiling painted with stars and constellations. Ethan had already moved his few belongings in, and his baseball glove sat on the window seat like a talisman of normalcy in their increasingly mysterious adventure. Michael studied the star map on the ceiling, wondering if it held any significance. The constellations were accurately portrayed, but certain stars were painted in gold while others remained silver. Following the pattern, the golden stars formed the same interlocking circles they were seeking. "It's Orion," Ethan said, following Michael's gaze. "We learned about it in school. The golden stars are showing us something different about the constellation." Michael realized his son was right. The golden stars, when connected, formed the circle pattern from their clues, and they all pointed toward a specific section of the room's curved wall. The wall section that drew their attention was covered by a large tapestry depicting a medieval hunting scene. When Michael moved the tapestry aside, he found that this section of the wall was slightly different from the rest. The stones were arranged in a subtle pattern that matched the interlocking circles. Working together, they discovered that one of the stones could be pressed inward. When Michael applied pressure, they heard a soft click, and a section of the wall swung open on hidden hinges, revealing a narrow staircase that spiraled upward into darkness. "A secret passage," Ethan whispered, his eyes wide with wonder. Michael peered up the staircase, feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. The steps were carved stone, worn smooth by age but still solid. A cool breeze drifted down from above, suggesting the passage led to another room, or perhaps even outside. "Should we explore it?" Ethan asked. Michael checked his watch. They had a few hours before he needed to head into town for a roofing job he'd picked up. The extra income was critical. The mansion might be free, but utilities, food, and basic supplies were steadily draining his savings. "Let's see where it goes," Michael decided. "But we stay together, and if it seems unsafe, we turn back." They climbed the narrow staircase slowly, Michael's phone flashlight illuminating the way. The passage was clearly original to the house. The stonework was masterful, and small alcoves were carved into the walls at regular intervals, probably meant to hold candles or oil lamps. The staircase ended at a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bands and fitted with an elaborate lock that looked like it would match their ornate key perfectly. Michael inserted the key and turned it slowly. The lock mechanism was well maintained despite its age, and the door opened smoothly to reveal a room that took his breath away. They had found Thomas Blackwood's private study, a circular chamber that must have been built into the mansion's highest tower. The room was untouched by time, as if Thomas had just stepped out moments ago. A massive desk dominated the center, covered with papers, books, and what appeared to be research materials. Built-in bookshelves lined the walls, and large windows provided a commanding view of the surrounding countryside. But it was the contents of the room that made Michael's heart race. This wasn't just a study. It was a command center for some kind of long-term project. The walls were covered with family trees, genealogical charts, maps, and what appeared to be financial documents dating back decades. At the center of it all was a portrait of Catherine, larger and more detailed than any of the photos in the album. She was beautiful, but there was a sadness in her painted eyes that spoke of difficult choices and sacrifices. Ethan moved to the desk while Michael examined the wall displays. "Dad, there's a journal here. It looks like someone was writing in it recently." Michael joined his son at the desk. The journal was bound in the same leather as the photo album, and the handwriting was definitely Thomas's. The final entry was dated just months before Thomas's disappearance. "The boy is grown now," the entry read. "He has a son of his own, struggling as I once struggled and his father before him struggled. The sterling debts must be paid, but not as Alexander believes. Justice requires restoration, not revenge. The treasure I've hidden will find its way to the rightful heir when the time comes. Catherine's legacy will live on through her grandson, even if he never knows her name." Michael's hands trembled as he read the words. Thomas had been writing about him, about Ethan. Somehow this mysterious great-uncle had known about their situation and had planned this inheritance as something more than simple family generosity. As he looked around the study with new understanding, Michael realized that their treasure hunt was just beginning. Thomas had left them clues not just to hidden wealth, but to a family history they'd never known they possessed. And somewhere in this house, a fortune waited to be claimed if they could solve the puzzles Thomas had left behind. Michael spent the rest of that day reading Thomas's journal, while Ethan explored the secret study with the wonder of a child discovering buried treasure. The journal revealed a complex story of love, betrayal, and redemption that stretched back nearly 60 years. Thomas Blackwood had been a successful industrialist in the 1960s, partnering with Richard Sterling in a series of manufacturing ventures that made both men wealthy. But Thomas had fallen in love with Richard's wife, Catherine, and she with him. Their affair had produced a son, but Catherine refused to leave her marriage, partly out of loyalty and partly to protect the child from scandal. The situation had deteriorated when Richard discovered the truth. Instead of confronting Thomas directly, he had systematically destroyed their business partnership, using his knowledge of the affair as leverage to force Thomas out of deals and steal contracts. By the time Thomas realized what was happening, Richard had gained control of most of their shared assets, leaving Thomas financially ruined and emotionally devastated. Catherine had died in a car accident when her son was only 5 years old, and Richard had remarried quickly, moving away with the boy and erasing any trace of Catherine's memory. Thomas spent the rest of his life trying to track down his son, eventually discovering that the boy had grown up believing Richard was his father, and Catherine was merely a stepmother who had died young. But Thomas's greatest discovery came near the end of his life when he learned that his son had married and had a child of his own, Ethan. The journal entries from Thomas's final years showed a man obsessed with making amends for the past, determined to provide for the grandson he would never meet. "I cannot undo the damage Richard Sterling inflicted," Thomas had written, "but I can ensure that Catherine's bloodline inherits what was stolen from us. The boy Michael struggles as I once struggled. The cycle must be broken." Michael felt a strange mixture of grief and connection as he read these words. The grandfather he'd never known, the one his father had believed was Richard Sterling, had actually been Thomas Blackwood. His entire family history had been built on a lie. The journal also revealed the location of the next clue in Thomas's elaborate treasure hunt. An antique compass hidden in the mansion's wine cellar would point not to magnetic north, but to specific locations within the house where Thomas had concealed evidence of the fortune he had accumulated in secret over the decades. Finding the wine cellar required following another set of clues from the study. Thomas had drawn detailed diagrams of the mansion's hidden passages and secret rooms, revealing that the house had been designed as much for concealment as for comfort. As Michael studied the diagrams, he realized something else. Alexander Sterling must know at least some of this history. His comment about debts between families and his intense interest in the property made sense if he believed his father had been wronged by Thomas, rather than the other way around. The enmity between the families had passed to the next generation, but with the truth distorted by time and lies. Michael looked over at Ethan, who had fallen asleep on the study's leather sofa, exhausted by their morning of exploration. Sunlight streamed through the tower windows, illuminating his son's peaceful face. Whatever secrets the mansion still held, whatever conflicts lay ahead with Alexander Sterling, Michael knew he had to see this through, not just for the promised fortune, but for the truth about their family. He carefully closed Thomas's journal and placed it back on the desk. Tomorrow they would continue following the trail of clues, but for now he needed to let Ethan rest and prepare for his afternoon job. The mortgage broker in town had hired him to repair some storm damage to his roof. Mundane work compared to their treasure hunt, but necessary to keep food on their table while they unraveled the mansion's mysteries. As he watched his sleeping son, Michael made a silent promise to both Ethan and the great-grandfather, whose blood flowed in their veins. He would solve the puzzle Thomas Blackwood had left for them. He would reclaim what had been stolen from their family, and he would make sure that Catherine's legacy, this grand house and whatever fortune awaited discovery, would provide the security and opportunities for Ethan that both he and Thomas had struggled to create. Sometimes life pushed a man so far down that he'd take anything thrown his way, even if it seemed like another burden. But sometimes what looked like a burden was actually a gift in disguise, a chance to reclaim not just prosperity, but identity, history, and justice. The mansion nobody wanted might turn out to be the most valuable inheritance of all. Michael returned from his roofing job with aching muscles and a small roll of cash that would cover groceries for the week. The late afternoon sun painted the mansion's facade in golden light, temporarily masking its decay, with a warm glow that hinted at former glory. He found Ethan in the kitchen with Mrs. Wilson, who had brought over sandwiches and was telling his son stories about Millbrook's history. The glint in Ethan's eyes told Michael that the boy was bursting to share their discoveries, but he'd kept their secret as instructed. They couldn't be certain how much Mrs. Wilson knew about Thomas Blackwood's hidden legacy or whether she could be fully trusted yet. Mr. Mrs. Wilson departed. Father and son retreated to Thomas's hidden study to examine the journals more carefully. The records painted a complicated picture of Thomas and Richard Sterling's relationship, one that contradicted everything Alexander had implied. According to Thomas's meticulous notes, the two men had started as genuine friends and business partners in the late 1950s, building a manufacturing empire that specialized in precision machine parts. Their company, Blackwood Sterling Industries, had grown from a small workshop to a regional powerhouse employing hundreds. The trouble began when Thomas fell in love with Catherine Richards' young wife. Thomas's journal entries from that period revealed a man tormented by guilt, yet unable to deny his feelings. Catherine had been unhappily married to Richard, who treated her more as a possession than a partner. One entry particularly stood out, dated June 1971. I have tried to stay away to honor the vows they made before God, but when Catherine looks at me with those eyes that seem to see into my very soul, I cannot pretend. God help me, I cannot pretend anymore. Their affair had remained secret for nearly a year before Catherine discovered she was pregnant. Thomas had wanted her to leave Richard to start a new life together, but Catherine feared the scandal would destroy all their lives. Instead, she had chosen to remain with Richard and allowing him to believe the child was his. The deception might have continued indefinitely if not for the child's unmistakable resemblance to Thomas as he grew. When the boy was 4, Richard had begun to suspect the truth. Rather than confronting either of them directly, he had embarked on a calculated campaign of revenge. Richard used his political connections and financial leverage to systematically dismantle Thomas's stake in their business. He manipulated contracts, diverted clients, and eventually forced Thomas out of the company they'd built together. By the time Thomas realized what was happening, Richard had already secured legal control of most of their shared assets. Catherine had tried to intervene, but her efforts only intensified Richard's determination. According to Thomas's journal, she had been driving to meet with their attorney about securing some assets for her son's future when her car went off the road in a rainstorm. She died before reaching the hospital. Thomas's grief leaped from the pages, raw and devastating, even decades later. She was light itself, warmth in human form. The world grows colder with each day she's gone. I remain only to protect what's left of her, our son, who will never know me as his father. Michael set the journal down, feeling the weight of this family tragedy. The parallels to his own life were unsettling. He too had lost the woman he loved, though to abandonment rather than death. He too was raising a son alone, struggling to provide stability and security. Dad, look at this. Ethan had been examining a large map on the study wall, a detailed rendering of the mansion's grounds and structural features. His finger traced a faint line that appeared to indicate a tunnel leading from the wine cellar to a chamber beneath the foundation. According to Thomas's notes, the mansion had been built in 1878 by his grandfather, Jeremiah Blackwood, who had designed several unusual features that later generations had maintained and expanded. The house sat atop natural limestone caves, which Jeremiah had incorporated into the foundation. Thomas had apparently used these underground spaces to create a secure vault for his most precious possessions, including evidence of Richard Sterling's crimes. Michael wondered if Alexander Sterling knew about these hidden chambers. His desperation to acquire the property suggested he suspected something valuable remained concealed within its walls. But did he know the full truth about his father? Did he know that Thomas Blackwood was his grandfather's true business partner, not the embezzler his father had portrayed? Michael's contemplation was interrupted by the distant sound of a car engine. Moving to the tower window, he saw a county vehicle pulling up to the house. A man in an official-looking uniform stepped out, clipboard in hand. "Let's get back downstairs. We need to close up the study and hide its entrance." They carefully secured the hidden room, replacing the tapestry that concealed the secret door in the tower bedroom. By the time the doorbell rang, they were innocently working on cleaning the front parlor. The visitor introduced himself as Frank Donovan from the county building department. "We've received a complaint about possible code violations at this property. I'll need to conduct an inspection." Michael kept his expression neutral, though inwardly he burned with suspicion. Sterling was wasting no time in creating problems. "A complaint from whom we just moved in 3 weeks ago." Donovan consulted his clipboard. "Anonymous tip. Something about unsafe electrical work being performed without permits." Michael took a deep breath, containing his frustration. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental, but arguing would only make things worse. I haven't done any electrical work beyond replacing a few light fixtures. But you're welcome to look around. The inspection took over an hour with Donovan methodically checking every room. He seemed particularly interested in the tower lingering near the wall that concealed the secret passage. Eventually, he presented Michael with a list of violations that would cost thousands to address, far more than Michael's limited savings could cover. You've got 30 days to bring these items up to code, or the county can declare the structure uninhabitable. Donovan's voice carried no emotion, merely stating bureaucratic fact. After the inspector left, Michael paced the front porch, anger and worry competing for dominance. The violations weren't imaginary. The house genuinely needed the upgrades, but the selective enforcement reeked of manipulation. Sterling was using his influence to pressure them into selling, creating financial hurdles they couldn't overcome. Mrs. Wilson appeared at the fence, her expression confirming his suspicions. I saw the county car. Building Inspector Michael nodded grimly. 3,000 in electrical upgrades, 2,000 in plumbing work, and a structural assessment that'll cost another 1,000. All due in 30 days. She snorted derisively. Same playbook he used on the Hendersons in '05 and the Patels in '11. Create enough regulatory problems that the owners can't afford to keep the place, then swoop in with a generous offer to take it off their hands. Her words confirmed what Michael had already suspected. But why is Sterling so fixated on this property? Even if he believes Thomas stole from his father, the house itself isn't worth that much, especially not to a wealthy attorney. Mrs. Wilson glanced toward her own house, then back at Michael. There's something Sterling wants that only Thomas knew about. Something valuable enough to justify decades of pursuit. When Thomas disappeared 12 years ago, Sterling was convinced the secret died with him. Then you showed up, direct bloodline, carpenter's hands just like Thomas, and a son the same age Thomas's grandson would be. Her words sent a chill through Michael despite the warm evening air. You knew Thomas well, didn't you? Better than most. We grew up together in this town. I watched what Richard Sterling did to him, how he twisted the truth until black became white. The calculated way he used knowledge of the affair to seize control of their company while painting Thomas as the villain. When Catherine died, something in Thomas broke. He withdrew from everyone except me. Michael hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. We found Thomas's private study and his journals. Mrs. Wilson's eyes widened slightly, the only indication of surprise on her weathered face. So you know about Catherine, about your father? My father, Michael, felt the ground shift beneath him, though he stood perfectly still. Catherine's son, the child she claimed was Richard's, but was actually Thomas's. That was your father, James, which makes Thomas your grandfather, not your great-uncle, as the will stated. Thomas changed the relationship in the legal documents to avoid raising Sterling's suspicions when he arranged for you to inherit. The revelation struck Michael like a physical blow. His entire family history had been built on a foundation of lies. The father he'd admired, who'd taught him woodworking and integrity, had never known his true parentage. James Foster had died believing he was Richard Sterling's son, never knowing that the man who had betrayed his mother was not his father, but his stepfather. Why didn't Thomas ever tell my father the truth? Wilson's expression softened with old sorrow. He tried once, approached James after Richard died, but your father refused to believe him, thought Thomas was trying to manipulate him somehow. The Sterling poison ran deep. Richard had spent years telling James that Thomas was a jealous partner who had embezzled from their company and harbored inappropriate feelings for Catherine. By the time Thomas found him again, James wanted nothing to do with anyone connected to his childhood. The weight of generational deception settled over Michael. His father had died never knowing his true heritage, carrying Richard Sterling's lies to his grave. And now Alexander Sterling, technically no blood relation to Michael at all, was using the same manipulative tactics his father had employed, trying to claim what remained of the Blackwood legacy. Sterling doesn't know I'm Thomas's grandson, does he? Not for certain, but he suspects. Why else would Thomas leave everything to a distant relative? Sterling's been investigating your family for years, trying to find the connection. That's why you need to be careful. Very careful. The next morning, Michael took Ethan to the hardware store to purchase supplies for the electrical repairs. They couldn't afford to complete all the required upgrades, but perhaps addressing the most critical violations would buy them time. Every dollar spent on the house was one less for their living expenses, forcing Michael to take on additional odd jobs around town. While selecting circuit breakers, Michael overheard two locals discussing the old Blackwood place in hushed tones. Haunted, one insisted. People disappearing, strange noises at night. New family's going to end up just like the others broke or worse. Michael ignored the gossip, though he noted how Sterling's campaign extended beyond legal harassment to social isolation. Creating an atmosphere of suspicion and fear around the property made it easier to pressure owners into selling. Returning to the mansion, they discovered a letter from the Environmental Protection Agency in their mailbox, citing concerns about potential soil contamination from the property's previous use. Testing would cost $2,500, with remediation potentially running into tens of thousands if problems were found. It's another Sterling tactic, Michael muttered, crumpling the letter. The house has never been anything but residential. There's nothing to test. Ethan's small hand rested on Michael's arm. We're not giving up, right? We can't let the bad guys win. The simple certainties in his son's voice steadied Michael. No, buddy, we're not giving up. This house is our home now, and we're going to fight for it. That afternoon, they resumed their investigation, following Thomas's map to the wine cellar entrance. The cellar stairs descended from a door off the kitchen pantry, leading to a cavernous space with stone walls and an arched ceiling. Empty wine racks lined the walls, and the air held the musty sweetness of vanished vintages. According to Thomas's notes, the wine cellar connected to a natural limestone cave system that extended beneath the property. One section had been carefully modified to create a secure vault where Thomas had hidden evidence of Richard Sterling's financial crimes along with his own accumulated wealth. Michael examined the cellar walls, looking for anomalies that might indicate a hidden entrance. The wine racks appeared to be original features crafted from the same walnut as the mansion's grand staircase. One rack seemed different from the others, its proportions slightly off its placement, awkward relative to the cellar's layout. When he pulled experimentally on the rack's edge, it swung outward like a door, revealing a narrow opening beyond. Behind the false rack was a niche containing a small wooden box. Inside lay an antique brass compass, its case engraved with the same symbols they'd found on the ornate key. Ethan crowded close at his breath fogging in the cellar's cool air. It's beautiful. Michael opened the compass, watching as the needle swung wildly before settling in a direction that definitely wasn't north. It pointed toward the back wall of the cellar, indicating what appeared to be solid stone. Examining the wall more carefully, Michael noticed subtle irregularities in the mortar between certain stones. Following the pattern suggested by the compass, he pressed against a central stone. Nothing happened. He tried turning the compass, slightly watching as the needle adjusted. The symbols around the compass face weren't just decorative, they were indicators for calibrating the instrument. When properly aligned, the compass led them to a different stone, one that moved inward when pressed. A grinding sound echoed through the cellar as a section of the wall slid sideways, revealing a rough-hewn passage that led deeper beneath the house. Michael hesitated at the threshold. Let me go first, Ethan. Stay behind me, and if I tell you to go back, you run straight to Mrs. Wilson's house. Understand? Ethan nodded solemnly, but his eyes shone with excitement as they entered the passage. Michael's flashlight beam cut through darkness that felt centuries old, illuminating a tunnel that had been partially natural cave and partially constructed passageway. The air grew cooler as they descended, carrying the mineral scent of underground water. The passage widened into a small chamber with a stone table at its center. On the table lay a leather pouch carefully preserved. Michael opened it to find a collection of letters, their paper yellowed but intact, protected by the cave's constant temperature and humidity. The letters were from Catherine to Thomas, written over years of their relationship. They revealed a woman torn between loyalty to her marriage vows and a love that she believed was her true destiny. Her handwriting was elegant but emotional, the ink sometimes blotched where tears had fallen. One letter, dated shortly before Catherine's death, contained a revelation that stunned Michael. My dearest Thomas, I've spoken with my attorney about securing James's future. If anything should happen to me, there is a trust fund established in his name, accessible only to him or his direct descendants. Richard must never know about it. The account information is hidden, where only someone who truly understands our story would think to look in the heart of our beginning. The compass led them onward deeper into the cave system until they reached another chamber. This one appeared to have been deliberately constructed with smooth walls and a level floor. At its center stood a stone pedestal holding a small iron safe. The safe's dial was marked not with numbers, but with symbols matching those on the key and compass. Michael studied the pattern, recognizing that the combination wasn't a random sequence, but specific dates important in Thomas and Catherine's relationship. Working through the clues from the letters and journal, he carefully turned the dial. The first number represented the day they met. Catherine had mentioned it in one of her letters as the day fate changed its course. And the second was James's birthday, and the third was the date of Catherine's death. When half my soul departed, as Thomas had written in his journal, the safe opened with a satisfying click, revealing documents that had been preserved for decades. Financial records showed that Catherine had indeed established a trust fund for James with initial capital that would have grown substantially over the years. More importantly, the documents contained evidence that Richard Sterling had been systematically defrauding not just Thomas, but multiple business partners throughout his career. Bank statements, contracts with suspicious amendments, letters from concerned investors, all painted a picture of a man who had used his charm and connections to build a financial empire based on manipulation and theft. Richard had created a complex network of shell companies to hide his activities, always ensuring that others took the blame when his schemes were discovered. But the most damning evidence was a recorded conversation preserved on a cassette tape with a player kept carefully alongside it. Thomas had apparently confronted Richard shortly before his disappearance and had secretly recorded their exchange. Michael played the tape, hearing first Thomas's voice, surprisingly similar to his father's, and then another man's, presumably Richard Sterling. The audio quality was poor, but Sterling's arrogant tone came through clearly. "You think you're so clever, Thomas, but I've been playing this game longer than you have. Every partnership, every deal, every trust fund, I take what I want and leave others holding the responsibility. It's not theft if you're smart enough not to get caught." The recording went on to detail specific crimes, including Sterling's plan to frame Thomas for embezzlement and disappear with both their accumulated wealth. What Sterling hadn't known was that Thomas had already moved his assets to secure locations, preparing for exactly this betrayal. As Michael and Ethan explored further following the compass through the underground chambers, they discovered more hiding places containing pieces of Thomas's legacy. One cache held rare coins and small art objects, portable wealth that could be easily transported and converted to cash if necessary. Another contained property deeds and investment certificates showing that Thomas had quietly built a second fortune after being forced out of Blackwood Sterling Industries. The compass led them to a final chamber larger than the others and clearly intended as the heart of Thomas's underground sanctuary. The walls were lined with filing cabinets containing meticulously organized records of Richard Sterling's crimes against dozens of business partners and investors. Thomas had spent decades tracking down people who had been ruined by Sterling's schemes, collecting their stories and evidence. But the chamber's central feature was a portrait of Catherine that dominated one wall. She stood in a garden's sunlight, catching the auburn highlights in her hair, her expression both gentle and resolute. Beneath the portrait was an inscription, "For love that transcends time and justice that cannot be denied." A small plaque on the frame contained a riddle, "Where two hearts first joined, the greatest treasure waits." According to Catherine's letter, this was where she had hidden the trust fund information, in the heart of our beginning. Michael studied the portrait, then the room, searching for clues. The compass needle spun directionless in this chamber, as if its purpose had been fulfilled in bringing them here. The ornate key they'd found in the wall seemed to have no corresponding lock. "Let me see the letters again, Dad." Ethan had been reading through Catherine's correspondence while Michael examined the portrait. In one of them, she talks about meeting Thomas for the first time in the gazebo on the east lawn. She says it was where they first touched hands, and she felt like she'd come home after a lifetime of wandering. Michael looked out the chamber's single small window, which offered a view of the overgrown grounds. The gazebo was barely visible through years of untended growth, its white paint peeling its roof partially collapsed. Could that be the heart of our beginning? The sun was setting by the time they emerged from the underground chambers, casting long shadows across the mansion's grounds. The gazebo stood at the edge of what had once been formal gardens, now a tangle of wild roses and volunteer saplings. As they approached, Michael saw that, despite its dilapidated appearance, The structure's foundation remained sound, 8 stone pillars supporting a circular wooden platform. The central floor panel bore a carved heart, almost obscured by decades of weathering. Michael knelt to examine it, finding that the heart concealed a small compartment. Inside was a metal container hermetically sealed against moisture. The container held banking documents for an offshore account established in 1979, including access codes and instructions for claiming the funds. Catherine had created a trust with an initial deposit of $50,000, a substantial sum for that era. According to the accompanying statement, the trust had been managed by a Swiss bank, with instructions to reinvest all proceeds until claimed by James Foster or his direct descendants. After 45 years of compound growth, the account's value would be enormous. They returned to the house as darkness fell, laden with documents and newfound knowledge. Michael felt both elated by their discoveries and overwhelmed by their implications. Thomas had left them not just a house, but an entire legacy, wealth, evidence of Sterling family crimes and the truth about their bloodline. The question now was how to proceed. Alexander Sterling was clearly determined to prevent them from uncovering these secrets, using every legal and bureaucratic tool at his disposal to force them out. If Michael revealed what they'd found, Sterling might escalate to more dangerous tactics. But if they remained silent, they would eventually be crushed by the mounting costs and regulatory burdens Sterling was creating. That night, after Ethan was asleep, Michael sat in the kitchen with the evidence spread before him. The recorded confession would be particularly damaging to Sterling, whose family reputation rested on the myth of his father's business acumen and integrity. If Richard Sterling was exposed as a fraud and thief, the implications for his son's legal career and social standing would be devastating. Michael was so absorbed in his thoughts that he almost missed the sound of breaking glass from the front of the house. He froze, listening intently as footsteps moved through the parlor. Someone had broken in. Moving silently, Michael grabbed a hammer from his toolbox and edged toward the hall. 2 men in dark clothing were methodically searching the parlor, opening drawers and examining bookshelves. Their movements were too professional for common burglars. These were men with a specific target. Michael retreated to the kitchen, gathering the most crucial evidence and slipping it into his work bag. He needed to get to Ethan, then find a way out without being discovered. The back stairs would take him to the second floor without passing through the front hall. He crept up the service staircase, avoiding the steps that creaked. Ethan was still asleep in the tower room, unaware of the danger below. Michael gently shook him awake, pressing a finger to his lips to indicate silence. "Someone's in the house," he whispered. "We need to get out quietly. Take only what's important." Ethan immediately grabbed his baseball glove and a photo of his mother, showing a presence of mind that made Michael proud despite their peril. They moved to the tower room door, then froze as footsteps sounded on the main staircase. The intruders were coming up. Michael's mind raced. The tower room had only one visible exit, but they had an advantage. They knew about the secret passage. He guided Ethan to the hidden door behind the tapestry, triggering the mechanism that caused the wall section to swing inward. They slipped into the narrow staircase, closing the door behind them just as the footsteps reached the tower room. Through the wall, they could hear muffled voices. "Gotta be up here somewhere." Boss said the old man's study had journals, documents. "Check under the bed behind the furniture." The voice confirmed Michael's suspicions. These were Sterling's men searching for evidence of Thomas's legacy. They knew about the hidden study, but not how to access it. The secret entrance in the tower room remained undiscovered for now. Michael and Ethan climbed the hidden stairs to Thomas's study, where Michael quickly gathered the most important journals and documents. They couldn't carry everything, but they could take enough to prove Sterling's crimes and their own claim to the Blackwood legacy. A hidden exit from the study led to a narrow passage that eventually emerged behind a false panel in the garden shed. They slipped out into the night, making their way across the grounds to Mrs. Wilson's house. She answered their urgent knocking immediately, as if she'd been expecting trouble. "Sterling's men are in the house," Michael explained breathlessly. "They're looking for Thomas's records." Mrs. Wilson ushered them inside, looking unsurprised. Thomas anticipated this. "Come with me." She led them to her cellar, where a locked cabinet held duplicate copies of many of Thomas's records. "I've been his custodian for decades," she explained. "Every document, every recording, every piece of evidence, we made copies. I helped him organize and preserve it all in case something happened to the originals." Michael stared at the extensive archive. "You knew everything all along. About Catherine, about my father, about the underground chambers." "Not everything." Mrs. Wilson's eyes held decades of quiet determination, but enough to protect what Thomas valued most. When he disappeared, I feared Sterling had silenced him permanently. Then the will was executed, bringing you here, and I knew Thomas had outmaneuvered Sterling one last time. She removed a small object from her pocket, a locket identical to the one they'd found in the wine cellar. Thomas gave this to me before he disappeared. He said that when Catherine's grandson came to claim his inheritance, I should provide whatever help I could. Michael examined the locket, finding that it contained a tiny scroll similar to those they'd discovered earlier. But this scroll was different. It was a detailed map of the mansion's foundation, showing the location of what Thomas called the Vault of Truth. While we wait for Sterling's men to leave, Mrs. Wilson continued, let me tell you about the final chamber, the one Thomas prepared for his ultimate confrontation with the Sterling legacy. She explained that Thomas had spent his final years designing a series of tests that only someone who truly understood Catherine's story and cared about family would be able to solve. The underground chambers they'd already discovered were only preliminary stages leading to a final vault containing the bulk of Thomas's hidden fortune and the most damning evidence against the Sterling family. He built it beneath the mansion's northeast corner, Mrs. Wilson explained. The entrance is concealed behind what appears to be a solid stone wall in the basement's far corner. But the wall pivots when the correct sequence of stones is pressed coordinates taken from Catherine's birth dates and the longitude and latitude of the gazebo where they first met. Why create such an elaborate puzzle, Michael asked. Why not just tell me directly? Mrs. Wilson's weathered face softened with old sorrow. Thomas believed that wealth without understanding was worthless. He wanted his heir to know the full story. Catherine's courage, Richard's betrayal, the love that produced your father. Only someone who had followed the trail, who had read the letters and journals, would truly appreciate what was being preserved. Her explanation was interrupted by the sound of sirens approaching the mansion. Someone must have reported the break-in, Mrs. Wilson moved to her front window, peering through the curtains at the police cars now parked in front of the Blackwood house. Sheriff Williams is there, she reported. He's a good man, not in Sterling's pocket. This might be a blessing in disguise. If Sterling's men are caught breaking in, it undermines his efforts to pressure you legally. Michael watched as two men were led from the mansion in handcuffs, their faces illuminated by flashing red and blue lights. Sheriff Williams appeared to be questioning them intently, his expression growing more serious with each answer. Eventually, the sheriff crossed the street to Mrs. Wilson's house, knocking firmly on her door. She let him in, maintaining her role as a concerned neighbor. Mrs. Wilson, Mr. Foster, the sheriff, began, his expression grave. Those men claim they were hired by Alexander Sterling to retrieve documents that were stolen from his father's estate. They say you're harboring stolen property. Michael met the sheriff's gaze steadily. That's not true, Sheriff. Everything in this house rightfully belongs to my family. Thomas Blackwood was my grandfather, not my great-uncle, as the will stated. He changed the relationship in the legal documents to avoid raising suspicions. Those men broke into my home to steal evidence of crimes committed by Richard Sterling, Alexander's father. The sheriff's eyebrows rose slightly. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Foster. Michael gestured to the documents they'd brought from the house. I have proof, financial records, correspondence, even a recorded confession. Richard Sterling systematically defrauded his business partners, including Thomas Blackwood. When Thomas threatened to expose him, Richard destroyed his reputation and stole their company. Now Alexander is using the same tactics, trying to force me out so he can claim whatever's hidden in the house. Sheriff Williams examined the documents carefully, paying particular attention to the bank records showing suspicious transfers between Sterling accounts. This would explain a lot, he said finally. Over the years, several families in this county have been financially ruined after doing business with the Sterlings. There were allegations of fraud, but the evidence always seemed to disappear and witnesses would suddenly refuse to testify. The sheriff's radio crackled with a message from his deputies. The men in custody had apparently implicated Sterling, directly admitting he had hired them to search for specific documents in the Blackwood mansion. Mr. Foster, the sheriff said, gathering the evidence, I'd like you to come to the station tomorrow morning to make a formal statement. In the meantime, I'll post a deputy at your property. Those men won't be bothering you again tonight. After the sheriff left, Michael sat at Mrs. Wilson's kitchen table, processing the night's events. The confrontation he'd been dreading had begun, but not on Sterling's terms. The attorney's desperation had led him to overplay his hand, sending men to burglarize the mansion rather than continuing his legal harassment campaign. We should go back to the house, Michael decided. Sterling will know his men were caught. He might try something else. Mrs. Wilson shook her head firmly. Not tonight. Stay here where it's safe. The deputy will watch the house, and in the morning you can make your statement to the sheriff. Then, when you're ready, I'll help you find the final vault. Thomas waited decades for justice. One more night won't matter. Michael glanced at Ethan, who had fallen asleep on Mrs. Wilson's sofa, his baseball glove still clutched in one hand. His son had shown remarkable courage throughout their ordeal, but he deserved a night of peaceful rest before their final confrontation with the Blackwood legacy. Tomorrow, Michael thought, we'll find the vault of truth. Tomorrow, we'll settle all debts between the Blackwoods and Sterlings once and for all. The next morning dawned clear and bright sunlight streaming through Mrs. Wilson's kitchen windows as Michael prepared to leave for the sheriff's office. He had organized the evidence they'd gathered, creating a chronological record of Richard Sterling's crimes and Alexander's continuing efforts to conceal them. As he gathered his papers, Ethan appeared in the doorway, his expression serious beyond his years. Dad, what happens after we find the vault? Will we still live in the mansion? Michael realized he hadn't thought that far ahead. Their entire focus had been on solving Thomas's puzzle and surviving Sterling's harassment. The question of what came after remained unanswered. That's up to us, buddy. The mansion is our home now if we want it to be. It'll take work to restore it properly, but we have skills that Thomas didn't. He knew that when he left it to us. Ethan nodded, satisfied with the answer. He believed in his father's ability to rebuild what had been broken, to restore what time had worn away. It was a simple faith that Michael found both humbling and motivating. Michael's meeting with Sheriff Williams lasted several hours as he detailed the evidence against both Richard and Alexander Sterling. The sheriff's initial skepticism gave way to grim understanding as he reviewed the documents, particularly the recorded confession that laid bare Richard's methodology for defrauding his partners. This explains a lot of cold cases in my files, the sheriff admitted. Business partnerships that collapsed under suspicious circumstances, always with Sterling emerging wealthier while his partners lost everything. But without evidence, there was never anything we could do. Sterling has been using his father's playbook, Michael explained, creating bureaucratic and legal obstacles to force owners to sell properties he wants, then developing them for massive profits. The mansion is just his latest target. The sheriff nodded thoughtfully. This morning we received calls from the County Building Department, the Environmental Agency, and the Historical Preservation Society, all withdrawing their complaints against your property. Sterling must have realized his men talked and is trying to distance himself. That afternoon, Michael and Ethan returned to the mansion with Mrs. Wilson. A deputy remained stationed outside, ensuring no further intrusions while they continued their investigation. The house felt different, now less oppressive, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. Following Mrs. Wilson's guidance and the map from Catherine's locket, they made their way to the basement's far corner. The wall looked solid, but when Michael pressed the stones in the sequence, indicated Catherine's birth month, day and year followed by the coordinates of the gazebo, they heard a mechanical click deep within the stone. A section of the wall pivoted smoothly, revealing a tunnel that descended deeper than any they had explored before. This passage was different from the others, wider, taller, and lined with the same quality stonework as the mansion's foundation. Electric lights had been installed, controlled by an old-fashioned switch near the entrance. Mrs. Wilson smiled at their surprised expressions. Thomas modernized the final vault in his later years. He wanted to ensure his evidence would be preserved indefinitely. The tunnel led to a circular chamber carved directly from the bedrock beneath the mansion. At the center stood an ornate chess piece, a knight carved from what appeared to be solid marble. The knight was mounted on a pedestal that clearly served as some kind of control mechanism. According to the notes in Catherine's locket, the chess piece was the key to the final puzzle. Rotating it to specific positions would trigger mechanisms within the chamber walls, but only if the correct sequence was followed. A wrong move would reset the entire system. The walls themselves were covered with carved symbols and quotations, many from famous love poems, others appearing to be personal messages between Thomas and Catherine. At the center of it all was a quote that seemed to sum up Thomas's philosophy: "True love endures beyond death, beyond lies, beyond the schemes of small men who mistake wealth for worth." Michael studied the night carefully. Chess had been a passion of Thomas's mentioned frequently in his journals. The knight was the most unpredictable piece on the board, able to move in patterns other pieces couldn't follow, much like Thomas himself had operated beyond Sterling's expectations. The solution, Michael realized, wasn't about the knight's physical position, but what it represented in Thomas and Catherine's story. Their relationship had followed unconventional moves, advancing in unexpected ways despite obstacles. The correct sequence would mirror key moments in their journey together. The first position represented their meeting, the knight facing east toward the gazebo where they first connected. The second symbolized James's birth, the knight standing proud but separated from the queen. The third represented Catherine's death, the knight bowing in mourning. The fourth showed Thomas's disappearance, the knight moving to the board's edge, prepared to sacrifice itself to protect others. As Michael completed the sequence, they heard a mechanical rumbling beneath their feet. The floor at the chamber's center began to rise, revealing a vault that had been hidden beneath the stone. Unlike the rough-hewn chambers they'd explored earlier, this vault was a sophisticated, secure room with climate-controlled cases containing documents, photographs, audio recordings, and physical artifacts. Michael stared in amazement at the comprehensive archive Thomas had assembled. This wasn't just a hiding place for treasure, it was a time capsule, a complete record of the Blackwood legacy and the evidence Thomas had spent decades collecting. The vault's interior was lined with display cases containing original contracts, correspondence, financial records, and sworn statements that told the true story of the Blackwood-Sterling partnership. But most stunning of all was the collection of legal papers and fireproof filing cabinets, evidence that Richard Sterling hadn't just stolen from Thomas, but had embezzled funds from dozens of other business partners over a 30-year period. As they examined the contents, the sound of footsteps echoed through the tunnel behind them. Michael turned to see Alexander Sterling standing in the chamber entrance. His usual polished appearance disheveled his expression, a mixture of anger and desperation. Behind him stood two more men, not the burglars from the previous night, but equally professional-looking. Mr. Foster Sterling said, his voice tight with controlled fury, "I see you found my father's property at last." The sound of voices echoed from the tunnel beyond the metal gates. Sheriff Williams had arrived with his deputies, accompanied by two individuals in suits who carried themselves with the unmistakable authority of federal agents. Sterling remained frozen between the chess knight and the vault, his world collapsing around him. Michael positioned himself protectively in front of Ethan, watching as the attorney's carefully constructed facade crumbled. 4 decades of searching, planning, manipulating, all to protect and extend his father's lies, now ending in the very chamber Thomas had designed for this moment. "Mr. Sterling," the female agent called through the gate, "I'm Special Agent Sarah Chen with the FBI. We'd like to speak with you regarding allegations of racketeering, conspiracy, and financial fraud based on evidence provided by Mrs. Wilson this morning." Sterling's men immediately distanced themselves, moving toward the gates with their hands visible. "This wasn't what we signed up for, boss. We were just supposed to help you search for some old documents." Mrs. Wilson nodded toward Michael with quiet triumph in her eyes. She'd been preparing for this moment far longer than any of them realized. Thomas kept meticulous copies of everything she explained. "I've been submitting evidence to the FBI for the past month, building the case piece by piece. When you found the final vault, it was the confirmation they needed." The attorney's composure, maintained through decades of manipulation and deceit, finally shattered. His voice, when he spoke, carried none of its former authority. It was all lies. Thomas Blackwood's pathetic attempt to rewrite history. "My father was a brilliant businessman, not some common thief. Sheriff Williams and the federal agents managed to override the security system, raising the gates and entering the chamber with weapons drawn. Sterling offered no resistance as he was handcuffed and read his rights. His expression had gone vacant, the fight draining from him as the inevitability of his downfall registered. Agent Chen turned to Michael after Sterling was secured. "Mr. Foster, I'm going to need a complete statement from you regarding Mr. Sterling's harassment tactics in today's confrontation. But first, I'd like to document this room and its contents." She surveyed the climate-controlled cases with professional amazement. "What you've uncovered here goes beyond a family dispute. These records document one of the largest private embezzlement schemes in American history." The next several hours passed in a blur of activity. Federal agents photographed and cataloged the vault's contents, while Michael provided a detailed statement about their discoveries and Sterling's escalating attempts to force them from the property. Ethan remained close to his father's side, watching the proceedings with solemn interest, occasionally answering questions, when Agent Chen gently included him in the conversation. By late afternoon, Sterling and his men had been transported to the county jail pending formal charges. Mrs. Wilson sat with Michael and Ethan in the kitchen, the ornate key that had started their adventure resting on the table between them. "They'll transfer Sterling to federal custody tomorrow," she explained, pouring tea with the steady hands of a woman who'd carried secrets for decades. "The evidence against him is overwhelming. Not just financial crimes, but witness intimidation, corporate espionage, even conspiracy to commit burglary after last night's break-in." Michael gazed at the key, its brass surface catching the afternoon light. "It seems unreal that it's finally over. Thomas spent his whole life preparing for this moment, and he never got to see it happen." Mrs. Wilson's weathered face softened with old sorrow. "Thomas knew he might not live to see justice done. That's why he created this elaborate puzzle to ensure that even after his death, the truth would eventually come to light. He disappeared 12 years ago, you know. I've always believed Richard's associates were responsible, though we never found proof." Ethan's small fingers traced the symbols on the key. "Did great-grandpa Thomas know about us, about me and Dad?" Mrs. Wilson nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "He tracked down your father after Richard Sterling died, tried to tell him the truth about his parentage, but James wouldn't believe him. Richard had poisoned his mind too thoroughly. Thomas never stopped watching over your family from a distance, though. When your grandmother passed away 5 years ago, Thomas altered his will to ensure everything would come to you both when the time was right." Michael thought about his father, a good, honest man who died believing a lie about his own identity. James Foster had raised his son with the same values of hard work and integrity that Thomas had embodied, despite never knowing his true heritage. The realization brought both comfort and renewed grief. That night, after Ethan had fallen asleep, Michael returned to the vault alone. Agent Chen had placed seals on the most critical evidence, but had granted him access to the family documents. He sat at the small desk Thomas had installed in the corner, reading through journals that chronicled decades of patient vigilance. The entries painted a picture of a man who'd lost everything that mattered: his business partner to corruption, his beloved to death, his son to Lisa, yet had refused to surrender to bitterness. Instead, Thomas had channeled his pain into a meticulous quest for justice, gathering evidence against Richard Sterling while quietly building a second fortune to replace what had been stolen. Most poignant were the passages about Catherine. Thomas had preserved every memory of their time together, from their first meeting in the mansion's gazebo to their final goodbye when she'd chosen to remain in her marriage for their son's sake. Her auburn hair appeared in his descriptions again and again, always catching sunlight, or framed against snow, or brushing his cheek in stolen moments. Michael discovered a small velvet box tucked between journal volumes. Inside lay Catherine's wedding ring, not the one Richard had given her, but a simple band Thomas had placed on her finger during a private ceremony only they had witnessed. Accompanying the ring was a letter in Catherine's flowing script, its paper yellowed, but words still clear after all these years. "My dearest Thomas," she had written, "if you are reading this, fate has separated us too soon. Know that the greatest joy of my life was loving you despite all we could not have together. Our son carries both our hearts within him, even if he never learns your name. This ring belongs to the future. Give it someday to someone who loves with the same courage we found in each other. Until we meet again in whatever lies beyond this life, I remain eternally yours, Catherine." Tears blurred Michael's vision as he carefully refolded the letter. Catherine had been pregnant with their second child when she died, another revelation that explained Thomas's decades of determined preparation. He hadn't just lost his love, he'd lost an entire future family in that car accident. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Mrs. Wilson stood in the doorway, her expression understanding. "I thought I might find you here. Some truths can only be faced alone the first time." Michael carefully returned the ring to its box. "Did you know about the second child?" She nodded, joining him at the desk. "Catherine told me just days before the accident. She was planning to leave Richard finally to build a life with Thomas and both their children. The accident happened while she was driving to meet with her attorney about divorce proceedings. The weight of generational tragedy settled over Michael. So much loss, so many lives altered by Richard Sterling's vengeance. And now Alexander continuing the same pattern of destruction." Mrs. Wilson placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Thomas believed that love outlasts everything. even death, even lies, even generations of separation. That's why he built all this, not just to expose the Sterling's crimes, but to reconnect the family that should have been. The next morning brought Agent Chen back to the mansion, accompanied by a distinguished woman in her 50s who introduced herself as Dr. Rebecca Martinez, director of the National Financial Crimes Investigation Center. We've been tracking the Sterling family's operations for nearly a decade, Dr. Martinez explained, as they sat in the formal dining room, now cleared of dust and partially restored. But they were always one step ahead of us. Witnesses would suddenly recant, evidence would disappear, judges would recuse themselves for mysterious reasons. Your grandfather's evidence changes everything. Agent Chen spread photographs across the table, mansions, historic properties, and architectural landmarks from across the country. Each property had been acquired under suspicious circumstances by shell companies we now know were controlled by Sterling. The pattern is always the same: create regulatory problems the owners can't afford to address, apply legal pressure through multiple channels, then swoop in with a generous offer when they're desperate. Michael recognized the predatory pattern all too well. The inspection, the environmental testing, the historical society petition, Sterling had been systematically setting them up for financial failure. Dr. Martinez leaned forward, her expression intense. Mr. Foster, we'd like to offer you a consulting position with our task force. Your experience with Sterling's tactics, combined with your carpenter's knowledge of historical properties, would be invaluable in helping other families fighting similar battles. The offer caught Michael by surprise. I'm not an investigator or a lawyer. What could I possibly contribute? You've experienced what these families are going through. Agent Chen explained. You understand the emotional manipulation. The financial pressure points the way these predators isolate their targets. And more importantly, you've beaten them at their own game. Michael thought about the other families represented in those photographs, people who had lost homes, histories, legacies to the Sterling operation. His situation had been unique. He'd had Thomas's careful preparations guiding him. Most victims wouldn't have such protection. I'll need to discuss it with Ethan, he said finally. And I want to focus on restoring the mansion and establishing the foundation first. But yes, I'd like to help if I can. Dr. Martinez nodded, satisfied. Take your time. The Sterling network took decades to build. Dismantling it properly will require patience. And speaking of the foundation, she slid a legal folder across the table. We've expedited the processing of the trust fund Catherine established for your father. The account currently holds just over $12 million, which legally belongs to you as James Foster's heir. Michael stared at the documents, the reality of their changed circumstances still difficult to grasp. 3 weeks ago, he'd been facing eviction from a one-bedroom apartment. Now he was responsible for a mansion, a multi-million-dollar trust, and potentially a role in a federal investigation. The weight of it all felt simultaneously terrifying and right, as if his life had finally clicked into its proper alignment. The remainder of Thomas's assets are still being inventoried, Agent Chen added. But conservative estimates place the total value at around $200 million, including investment properties, art collections, and offshore accounts. Richard Sterling stole approximately $50 million from your grandfather in the 1970s. Adjusted for inflation and investment returns, Thomas managed to rebuild and exceed what was taken. Michael's mind reeled at the figures. What had seemed like a fortune beyond imagining was in fact the product of one man's lifetime of disciplined work and careful investment. Thomas hadn't just sought revenge. He'd rebuilt everything that had been stolen dollar by patient dollar. I don't want Ethan growing up thinking money solves everything, he said finally, or that wealth is what makes a person valuable. Thomas and Catherine seem to have understood that. Dr. Martinez smiled. That's precisely why you're the right person to manage their legacy, Mr. Foster. The attorneys will contact you next week to begin formal transfer of all assets. In the meantime, Agent Chen will coordinate with you regarding evidence the prosecution will need for Sterling's trial. As the federal agents departed, Michael found Ethan in the garden with Mrs. Wilson helping clear decades of overgrowth from what had once been Catherine's rose beds. His son's face was smudged with dirt, his expression more carefree than Michael had seen in years. Are we rich now, Dad? Ethan asked that evening as they ate dinner in the newly functional kitchen. Really rich like in movies, Michael considered the question carefully. We have resources now, which is different from just having money. Thomas and Catherine built something meant to last generations and help others. That comes with responsibility. Ethan nodded, digesting this with the surprising maturity he'd shown throughout their ordeal. Like Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. Exactly like that, Michael agreed, grateful for the simplified reference point. What matters isn't having money, but what you choose to do with it. Over the following weeks, a transformation began, not just of the mansion, but of their understanding of Thomas and Catherine's legacy. Working with Mrs. Wilson, Michael established the formal structure for the Catherine Blackwood Foundation, designed to assist families in crisis, particularly single parents, struggling to provide stable homes for their children. The foundation's first initiative focused on families facing predatory real estate practices similar to Sterling's tactics. Michael worked with local attorneys to create a legal defense fund, providing representation to homeowners fighting harassment from developers. The work brought him into contact with dozens of families, with stories echoing his own people facing bureaucratic obstacles, mysterious code violations, and escalating financial pressure designed to force them from their homes. Meanwhile, the mansion itself gradually shed its neglected appearance. Michael hired local craftsmen, many struggling for work in the economically depressed region, to assist with the restoration. His own carpentry skills proved invaluable as they carefully preserved the historic features while updating critical systems. The electrical violations that had seemed so insurmountable weeks earlier were addressed methodically, room by room, until the house no longer presented any danger. Ethan threw himself into the restoration with enthusiasm, becoming an unofficial tour guide for the workers and developing an encyclopedic knowledge of Victorian architecture. He'd chosen to keep the star map on his tower room ceiling exactly as they'd found it, a reminder of the night they discovered their first secret passage. The most significant change came when Mrs. Wilson officially moved into the mansion's guest wing. At 73, she had lived alone since her husband's death 20 years earlier. The arrangement benefited everyone. She gained companionship and purpose as the foundation's administrative coordinator, while Michael and Ethan received her wisdom and the continuation of Thomas's institutional memory. 6 weeks after Sterling's arrest, Michael received a call from Sheriff Williams. "There's something you should see at the station," he said without elaboration. When Michael arrived, the sheriff led him to an evidence room where a box of personal effects waited. These were found in a storage unit registered to Thomas Blackwood, the sheriff explained. The rental payments were automated through a bank account that finally ran dry last month. The facility manager recognized the name from the news about Sterling's arrest and contacted us. Michael opened the box with trembling hands. Inside lay Thomas's personal possessions, his wallet, keys, watch, and a leather portfolio containing architectural sketches of the mansion. But it was the small, leather-bound notebook that captured Michael's attention. The final entry was dated just 3 days before Thomas's disappearance 12 years ago. "I've arranged everything," Thomas had written in his distinctive script. "The will, the trust, the evidence. Margaret will know when to act. Sterling continues his surveillance, but he'll never find what I've hidden. I leave tomorrow for Switzerland to secure the final accounts. If anything happens to me, the trail is laid for Catherine's grandson to follow when he's ready. The cycle of destruction ends with this generation." Michael closed the notebook, a mixture of grief and gratitude washing over him. Thomas had known the risks he faced, had prepared for the possibility that he might not return from that final journey. His disappearance hadn't been random misfortune, but likely the direct result of his efforts to secure justice and protection for future generations. When Michael shared the discovery with Mrs. Wilson that evening, she nodded solemnly. "I suspected as much." Thomas received threats in those final months, strange phone calls, vehicles following him. He dismissed my concerns, said everything that mattered was already protected. "Do you think Sterling had him killed?" Ethan asked, his young face serious beyond his years. Mrs. Wilson considered the question with the gravity it deserved. "We may never know for certain." Thomas was very careful, especially about his travel arrangements. The Swiss authorities investigated when he failed to arrive for his banking appointment, but no trace was ever found. The confirmation of Thomas's likely fate strengthened Michael's resolve to honor his grandfather's legacy. The foundation's work expanded, establishing scholarship programs for children of single parents and emergency assistance funds for families facing eviction or foreclosure. Each initiative embodied the values Catherine and Thomas had championed: stability, education, and the belief that no parent should face alone the struggle to provide for their children. 3 months after Sterling's arrest, the first federal trial began. Michael testified about the harassment campaign, submitting documentation of each regulatory obstacle Sterling had manufactured. More damaging were the recordings from Thomas's security system, capturing Sterling's explicit admissions about his father's crimes and his own determination to conceal them. The proceedings revealed the full scope of the Sterling operation: dozens of properties acquired through similar tactics, a network of corrupt officials paid to create problems for targeted homeowners, and millions in profits laundered through shell companies. Former associates turned state's evidence, describing Alexander's meticulous methods for identifying vulnerable properties and isolating their owners. When the verdict came, it was decisive. Sterling received 25 years in federal prison for racketeering, conspiracy, fraud, and witness intimidation. The judge, in her sentencing remarks, noted the multi-generational nature of the crimes. The defendant continued and expanded upon a criminal enterprise begun by his father, targeting vulnerable families and individuals using the machinery of government as a weapon against citizens it was designed to protect. The Sterling family's business empire crumbled as assets were frozen and subsidiaries investigated. Properties acquired through fraudulent means were restored to their rightful owners where possible, with compensation provided in cases where direct restitution wasn't feasible. The mansion that had once seemed like a burden to Michael now stood as a symbol of justice, finally served a family legacy reclaimed against overwhelming odds. On a crisp autumn afternoon, 6 months after their arrival in Millbrook, Michael stood in the mansion's restored garden, watching Ethan play catch with a friend from his new school. The baseball arced perfectly between them, Ethan's coordination having improved dramatically with regular practice. Michael had enrolled him in the local Little League team, something they could never have afforded in their previous life. The mansion itself had undergone a remarkable transformation. Fresh paint in historically accurate colors adorned the exterior, the sagging porch had been rebuilt to its original grandeur, and the broken windows had been replaced with custom-crafted reproductions. Inside, the rooms balanced preservation and livability, maintaining their Victorian elegance while incorporating modern necessities. Mrs. Wilson emerged from the house carrying a tray of lemonade for the boys. In her role as foundation director, she had blossomed her organizational skills and intimate knowledge of Thomas's intentions guiding their expanding programs. The guest wing had become her domain, but she spent most days in the foundation offices they'd established in what had once been the mansion's formal parlor. "Michael," she called, "Agent Chen is here with Dr. Martinez." They're waiting in the study. He found the two women examining the framed photographs now displayed on Thomas's desk, images of Catherine in the Garden of James as a child of Michael and Ethan on the day they'd first arrived at the mansion. The progression of generations told a story of separation and reunification of a family circle finally completed. "Mr. Foster," Dr. Martinez began, "I have some extraordinary news. Based on evidence from Thomas's archives, we've been able to trace almost 30 families who were victimized by Richard Sterling's schemes in the 1960s and 70s. The Justice Department has established a restitution fund of over $300 million to compensate these families for their losses." Michael absorbed this latest development, grateful that Thomas's meticulous record-keeping continued to bring healing decades after the original crimes. His grandfather had understood that true justice extended beyond personal vindication to encompass all who had suffered similar wrongs. Agent Chen added, "We've also identified 15 additional property schemes modeled on Sterling's methods operating across 5 states. 2 development companies have already been indicted based on the pattern your case helped establish. Your consulting work has been invaluable in helping us recognize the warning signs." In the months since accepting the consulting position, Michael had reviewed dozens of cases identifying the telltale signs of coordinated harassment. His experience as both a victim and a carpenter gave him unique insight into the tactical use of building codes and environmental regulations as weapons against homeowners. "I never imagined my carpentry background would be useful in federal investigations," he admitted. "But I suppose Thomas knew exactly what he was doing when he left the mansion to us." Dr. Martinez smiled. "Your grandfather built more than just a fortune and a case against the Sterlings. He created a template for exposing systematic exploitation of ordinary people by the wealthy and connected. The precedents established in Sterling's case will protect thousands of families for generations. After the federal agents departed, Michael returned to the garden where Ethan was showing his friend the secret entrance to one of the mansion's hidden passages. The boy had adapted to their new circumstances with remarkable resilience, neither defined by their previous poverty nor corrupted by their current prosperity. He remained fundamentally the same kind, curious child, now simply unburdened by the financial anxieties that had shadowed his earlier years. That evening, Michael tucked Ethan into bed in the tower room, now decorated with baseball pennants and model airplanes, though the star map on the ceiling remained untouched. Their nightly ritual had expanded to include stories about Thomas and Catherine, ensuring that the family history would not be lost again. Dad, Ethan asked sleepily, "Do you think great-grandpa Thomas and Catherine would be happy with what we've done with the house? With the foundation?" Michael looked up at the star map on the ceiling, thinking about the path that had led them here. The ornate key that had started their adventure now rested in a display case in Thomas's study, no longer needed to unlock doors, but preserved as a reminder of the journey they had taken together. "I think they'd be very proud, buddy. Not just of the house or the foundation, but of how you've handled everything. You've shown the same courage and compassion that made them special." After Ethan fell asleep, Michael made his evening rounds through the mansion, a habit he'd developed during their first weeks when the house had seemed full of mysteries. Now, each room held memories of their discoveries: the library where they'd found the photo album, the wine cellar with its hidden entrance to the caves, the vault chamber where they'd finally confronted Sterling. He ended his circuit in Thomas's study, where Catherine's portrait now hung above the fireplace. In the soft lamplight, her auburn hair seemed to catch invisible sunlight, her eyes holding the same quiet determination he sometimes saw in Ethan's expression. On the desk lay Thomas's journal, which Michael had taken to reading each evening, finding new insights with each review. "The measure of a man's worth," Thomas had written, "is not what he accumulates for himself, but what he preserves for future generations. Wealth that serves only its owner becomes worthless upon his death, but wealth that serves humanity becomes immortal." The words had become something of a mission statement for the foundation and for Michael's personal philosophy. The inheritance Thomas and Catherine had left wasn't primarily financial. It was a legacy of values of persistence in the face of injustice, of love that transcended even death and deception. Mrs. Wilson appeared in the doorway, her evening tea in hand. "Thomas would be pleased," she said simply. "You've become exactly the guardian he hoped for." Michael smiled, grateful for her steady presence. "I'm still learning what that means. Every day I discover something new about what they built, what they sacrificed." "That's as it should be." Mrs. Wilson settled into one of the study's leather chairs. "Great legacies aren't static monuments. They're living things that grow with each generation's stewardship." Michael had come to value these evening conversations with Mrs. Wilson, whose insights into Thomas and Catherine's story filled gaps the journals and letters couldn't capture. She had been the silent witness to their love affair, the keeper of their secrets, the protector of their legacy when all seemed lost. "Have you given any thought to Catherine's ring?" she asked, referring to the wedding band Thomas had preserved in its velvet box. "He always intended it for the woman you would eventually marry." The question brought a mixture of emotions. Michael's failed marriage to Ethan's mother had left wounds that were still healing, though the bitterness had faded with time and distance. The idea of opening himself to that vulnerability again seemed simultaneously frightening and full of potential. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that chapter yet," he admitted. "But I'm not closing the door on the possibility either." Mrs. Wilson nodded, understanding in her eyes. Catherine believed that love was worth any risk, any sacrifice. But she also understood that timing matters. The right person at the wrong time is still the wrong person. Their conversation was interrupted by the mansion's doorbell, an unusual occurrence at this late hour. Michael found Sheriff Williams on the front porch, holding a package wrapped in waterproof material. "This washed up on the riverbank about 20 miles downstream," the sheriff explained. "Old Hank Peterson found it while fishing this morning. Given what's inside, I thought you should have it immediately." The package contained a weathered leather satchel, its contents remarkably preserved despite obvious water damage. Inside were Thomas's passport, travel documents for Switzerland, and a sealed letter addressed simply, "For Catherine's grandson." The paper was fragile with age and moisture, but the writing remained legible. "If you are reading this, Thomas had written, "Then my precautions were necessary. I've arranged for this package to be released only in the event of my disappearance. By now, you will have found the key and begun the journey toward reclaiming our family's legacy. Trust Margaret Wilson completely. She alone knows every part of what I've prepared. Sterling will never stop searching, but neither must you. The truth hidden within the mansion will free not just our family, but many others from the shadow of injustice. Whatever happens to me, know that I go forward with peace, knowing that Catherine's bloodline will continue through you and your son. The love that created your father transcends death itself, just as the legacy I leave transcends mere wealth. Find the vault, expose the truth, rebuild what was broken. This is my final gift to you, not just restoration, but redemption." The letter confirmed what they had suspected about Thomas's fate. He had known the risks of his final journey, had prepared for the possibility that Sterling's associates might be watching. The discovery brought both closure and renewed grief. Thomas had sacrificed everything to ensure that justice would eventually prevail. Sheriff Williams cleared his throat. The river flows directly past an abandoned limestone quarry about 30 miles upstream. It was owned by a subsidiary of Sterling Enterprises until they sold it last year. We'll be conducting a thorough search of the area, though, after 12 years. His voice trailed off, the implication clear. If Thomas's body had been disposed of, their recovery was unlikely after so much time. But the confirmation of location might provide enough evidence to bring additional charges against those responsible. Michael carefully refolded the letter. "Thank you for bringing this to me personally. This means more than you can know." After the sheriff departed, Michael returned to the study where Mrs. Wilson waited. Her expression told him she already understood what the package contained. Thomas had prepared her for every eventuality, including his own disappearance. He knew, she said softly. "The night before he left, he told me, if I don't return, give them time to find their own way to the truth." He believed some journeys couldn't be shortened without losing their meaning. Michael placed the letter alongside Thomas's journal. His grandfather had created a path that required following, not just receiving. The elaborate puzzle hadn't been merely a security measure, but a way of ensuring that Michael would truly understand the history he was inheriting, would appreciate the sacrifices that had made it possible. The foundation's impact continued to grow throughout that first year. Using a portion of the recovered Sterling assets, they established scholarship programs in 12 states, emergency assistance funds for families in crisis and job training, centers specializing in helping single parents develop marketable skills. Each initiative embodied Catherine's compassion and Thomas's meticulous attention to sustainable systems. Michael's consulting work with the federal task force expanded as well, helping identify and prosecute property fraud schemes across the country. His practical knowledge of construction and codes made him particularly effective at recognizing when legitimate regulations were being weaponized against vulnerable homeowners. The work brought meaning beyond financial security, allowing him to transform his family's trauma into protection for others. Foster restoration became another outlet for Michael's skills, specializing in preserving historic homes while making them livable for modern families. The company employed local craftsmen, many of whom had struggled to find steady work in the economically depressed region. Their first major project beyond the mansion was renovating a Victorian apartment building to provide affordable housing for single-parent families participating in the Foundation's job training programs. On the anniversary of their arrival in Millbrook, Michael and Ethan planted a garden on the east lawn where the dilapidated gazebo had once stood. In its place now rose a new structure built to the exact specifications of the original where Thomas and Catherine had first met. White roses, Catherine's favorite according to Mrs. Wilson, climbed trellises around its perimeter, their fragrance filling the summer air. As they worked the soil preparing it for Catherine's favorite flowers, Ethan asked the question that had been forming in his mind throughout the year. "Dad, do you think we would have been different people if we'd grown up rich like this?" If great-grandpa Thomas had found Grandpa James earlier and told him the truth, Michael considered the question carefully. "Different, yes, but not necessarily better. Your Grandpa James was a good man who taught me the value of hard work and honesty, and you've shown more character dealing with hard times than many kids who've never faced a challenge. Money changes circumstances, but character comes from how you handle whatever life gives you." Ethan nodded, processing this as he patted soil around a rosebush. "I'm glad we found the mansion, but I'm also glad we didn't always have everything easy." That evening, they hosted a small gathering to mark the anniversary. Mrs. Wilson, Sheriff Williams' agent Chen, and a few of the craftsmen who had become friends during the restoration. The mansion's dining room, now fully restored to its original grandeur, echoed with conversation and laughter that seemed to warm the old wood and plaster breathing life back into spaces that had stood silent for decades. Michael found himself observing the scene with a sense of completion that had been missing for most of his adult life. The circle Thomas and Catherine had started broken by tragedy, and lies had finally closed. Their love story had not ended with Catherine's death or Thomas's disappearance, but had extended through generations, eventually bringing Michael and Ethan to exactly where they needed to be. Later, after the guests had departed and Ethan was asleep, Michael stood on the mansion's front porch with Mrs. Wilson watching fireflies rise from the lawn like stars ascending to meet their celestial counterparts. A year ago, Michael reflected, I was holding an eviction notice, wondering how I'd keep a roof over our heads. Now we're running a foundation, managing a restoration company, and consulting with federal investigators. Sometimes I still can't believe this is our life. Mrs. Wilson smiled, the porch light highlighting the silver in her hair. Thomas always said that life's greatest transformations come when we're finally ready for them, not a moment before. You and Ethan were ready to carry this legacy forward. That's why the key found its way to you. Michael thought about the journey that had brought them here, the discovery of the key, the photo album, the compass, and finally the vault. Each step had revealed not just clues to the hidden fortune, but pieces of a family history that had been stolen from them. The treasure had never been just the money. It had been the truth itself, the knowledge of who they were and where they belonged. The ornate key that had started their adventure now rested in a display case in Thomas's study. No longer needed to unlock physical doors, it remained a powerful symbol of doors opened in their lives, opportunities, understanding, healing, and purpose. Catherine's wedding ring waited in the safe for its eventual recipient, a promise that love could transcend even the darkest circumstances. As stars appeared in the darkening sky, Michael felt the presence of Thomas and Catherine in the mansion they had preserved for him, not as ghosts, but as living influences, their values and sacrifices shaping the choices he made each day. Their love story had ended in apparent tragedy, but its legacy continued in unexpected ways, touching lives far beyond their immediate family. The treasure hunt that had begun with a brass key hidden in a wall had led to something far more valuable than gold or property deeds. It had led to a sense of purpose and belonging, to a family reconnected across generations, to justice finally served, and to a legacy that would continue to inspire goodness long after all of them were gone. Michael glanced toward the tower room where Ethan slept beneath the star-mapped ceiling, then back to the gardens where Catherine's roses were beginning to bloom. Tomorrow would bring foundation work, restoration projects, consulting cases, the ongoing responsibilities of the life they'd built from Thomas's careful preparations. But tonight, in this peaceful moment, he simply gave thanks for the journey that had brought them home. The mansion nobody wanted had become the most valuable inheritance of all, not for its architecture or hidden treasure, but for the family story it preserved and the future it made possible. Their adventure among secret passages and hidden chambers had ended, but their real adventure, building a life worthy of the love that had preserved it for them, continued with each passing day.